Hey everyone, it's Andrew Nagel of Valk9 Designs, and we're back with the next part of the start to finish complex pendant design. This is going to be the backplating part of this pendant. In the previous parts, we've designed and built this piece. We set a lot of stones in there, and so if you haven't seen the previous parts, I suggest that you watch all of those first. And so to backplate this piece, we're going to need a couple of different things. The easiest way to do this is going to be with bezel, or you can just do the whole thing with sheet silver and kind of cut your own length of bezel. I'm going to go ahead and just use this bezel from Rio, and I'm going to be using this sheet silver for the actual back part of the backplate. And so basically what we're going to be doing is forming our bezel around the entire size of the pendant, and so we want our bezel to be flush against the walls and the shape of the piece. Once you have the right amount of bezel cut off, you can start to form it around the outline of your piece. Again, you want this to be flush up against the side wall of your design. Now I see a little part that I want to kind of cut out so I can make room for this half round wire that we have curling off of the side of our piece. So I'm going to mark that with a permanent marker, and then I'm just going to take my wire cutters and I'm just going to kind of chomp out a little bit of a section and then file that down as well. You don't have to cut it out with your wire cutters, you can just use the file to file out the section that you want. This is just a little bit of a faster process for myself, and so I'm going to score those with my cutters, and then I'm going to wiggle that little piece out and file it down. If you don't have a set of these files, I suggest that you get them. They're great for filing down pieces of wire if you need to. They're great for silversmithing work as well. So every jeweler needs a good set of files on hand. I have 3 different sizes at my bench. The smaller ones, are more of what you need for like wire wrapping and kind of to get into the fine details, and so that's where I would start off. Now that we've made this section where we want it to, it's time to finish bending in our outer portion here. I'm going to need to form this with some pliers, but I also need to bend out another little section to make room for this tiny little swirl that's also coming off. So I'm just going to cut a diagonal line and open this section up for the rest of these wires that come off of the side of our pendant here. So I cut off that corner, and then now I'm just going to use one of my files. This is the next size up from what I was just using, and I'm going to use this to open that up a bit more and make this the right size for our piece. Once your opening is wide enough, I ended up having to remove a bit more material than I thought I was originally going to need to, but that's finally big enough for the detailing to fit kind of snugly in between that opening. And then now I'm going to form this first part of the bezel around this curve on the left side of the pendant here. So just utilizing my pliers so that way I don't bend things either too far and I have a bit more control. Just going to do a slight little curve there. It's starting to look pretty good. I need to bend in this little section near the opening a bit more. So I'm going to use the pliers to kind of give that more of a dramatic swoosh right there. It's starting to fit pretty good, starting to look snug. Then we can start moving on to working this bezel around the rest of the piece and marking off the other parts that we're going to cut out for our detail components. So we're going to cut off a section here, and then I'm going to cut off a section up on this mid part for this other part of half round wire. So I'm going to go ahead and cut those, and then now we're back after removing those. I did end up cutting this into 2 pieces. I removed a little bit too wide of a section at the bottom part, so I ended up just separating those and bringing those 2 ends together, and when I solder this all together, I can solder those 2 components together back into one, and that way the opening is flush against my details. So now I'm going to form the straight side of the bezel, and I'm just going to use my flattened nose pliers for that. They're like a wide flat nose plier. These are great because they're just, straight along the side, and so that way they help me bend the bezel in a nice straight line, and so that way the line isn't curved where I've bent it. Opening that up a little bit more, just finding the right angles here. And so you're just going to bend your bezel along the angles of the side of your piece until it fits flush. Once you have your angles on your bezel completely flush against your piece, you're ready to square off your section of sheet silver. And so I'm just bringing this on here, and I'm going to mark it with a Sharpie. I don't want to heat up this whole sheet of silver, one, because it will, discolor the silver and scorch it. And so what I'm going to do is mark off just the section that I need for this piece, and then I'm going to take that over to the soldering block and I will solder just that section. Angling off the piece of sheet silver because I don't want to cut just a straight line. That'll leave a lot of extra waste, and so I'm going to leave as much of the silver untouched as possible. So now I can saw off this section and get ready to take this over to the soldering block. The saws that you need to saw sheet silver, or the saw blades preferably, are the saw blade number 2. You can find them in the description down below, and I'll also link a good saw handle, but there's also various different saw handles out there, and so look around and try them all out and see what works best for you. Again, the number 2 saw blade is what you need to cut sterling silver, and you need different, grits of saw to, different, tooth lengths of saw to cut various different metals. And so, find a reference sheet for that. I don't have one, unfortunately. I only cut silver. I haven't really worked with gold sheet. I don't know if I ever really will, because I just don't really prefer gold all that much. I might, but I don't know. It's just not my favorite. So what I've done right now is marked out this sheet with Sharpie, so that way I can see where I need my bezel to sit, so I'm not guesstimating when I solder it onto the sheet here. I'm just going to start off with 1/2. We're putting this side onto we're putting the left side of the bezel onto the sheet first. I've wiped this all down with flux. If you have not seen my soldering tutorials, I highly suggest that you check them out. It's the same process for soldering wire as it is for soldering sheet silver. It's just a little bit of a different soldering time because you have a bigger piece of metal to heat up and you need to distribute your heat more evenly. I'm cutting off some portions of solder because I'm just going to lay some pieces on there and then apply some heat to this. You'll notice that I am moving my torch around a lot to move the flame all over this piece. I'm applying some more solder, and yeah, I highly suggest that you get a solder pick so that way you can kind of poke at your solder. It's better than, scorching some torches or scorching your tools trying to push the solder around with your pliers. I'll leave an item number for some tungsten solder picks from Rio in the description. And again, just heating up the whole thing, trying to get the solder to flow on the inside of this bezel. Yes, I'm using 2 torches. It's a big piece of sheet silver, honestly. This pendant's like 3.5 inches tall. Generally, pieces aren't this large. Like a 3.5 inch tall pendant is a very tall pendant. It took me a long time to realize that. Most of the pieces out there that you're seeing from a lot of artists are in the 1.5 to 2.5 inch range. I've even been told that by a lot of artists too. When they finally see my work, they're like, "Wow, these are a lot larger than I thought they were." And I didn't realize that I was making such large pieces for the longest time. But soldering pieces of silver this large, like this sheet, definitely told me, or showed me what people mean by that. When you solder a piece of silver this big, it's really hard to keep the heat even on the piece and to get the solder to even flow. And so it's taken me a lot of different times of soldering and applying more flux, as you see here, and applying more solder to get this fully fused. one thing that I do after I've cooled off the piece by dipping it in water is I hold it up to a lamp and I let the light hit the bezel on both sides, and I try to see if there's any light that shines through the soldered edge. And if there's light that you can see shining through that bezeled edge at the bottom where it connects to the sheet, you've got to reheat it and you've got to apply either more solder or let the heat go more through. So now we set the pendant onto the backplate, just seeing if it fits all appropriately, and it fits in there snug as a bug in a rug, and so that is perfect. Now what we need to do is remove all of the extra portions of silver around the edge. We're just going to saw those off, and then what we need to do is file down the edges and then file down the bezel as well, just because it's sitting a little too high right now. You only want the bezel to sit over your pendant about a millimeter, maybe a millimeter and a half, depending on how much, you don't want to cover too much of your details is what I'm trying to get at. If you have like a 3mm bezel sitting above your pendant, you're going to end up covering a lot of the wire details that you did. So you don't want the bezel sitting too high over your piece, but you do want it high enough that it holds your piece in stable. And so this is what I mean. As you can see, I've got, almost like ½ inch of bezel sitting above this pendant. That's just way too much. So I'm going to mark this with a Sharpie, and then I'm going to mark the inside as well of the other one. I'm not going to touch the pendant with the Sharpie. I'm just going to run this, about like 2mm above the piece, just so that way the point isn't touching the pendant, and just marking off where I'm going to cut off this bezel. So I'm going to saw that all off, and then I'm going to cut out some sections for the stones to allow some light to pass through the backside. So after cutting off that bezel, you're ready to go ahead and drill out some holes. Be careful of sharp edges on the end of the pendant. File down what you need to, so that way you can work with this. It was workable for myself, and so I'm going to use a drill burr to drill through this silver, and then I'm going to use my saw to saw out those portions. Again, we're using a number 2 saw blade. I'm just using kind of a generic saw handle. I do want to get a Green Lion saw handle. I've heard very great things about their saw handles, and they're made out of wood. Very nice saw handles. For now, I'm just using this pretty generic one off of Rio, and it gets the job done, but it definitely doesn't have like the best clamps or the best grip even. So looking to upgrade at some point. So what you're going to do is just pop open one side of the saw blade and then slide that through the holes that you had just made, and then you're just going to saw all the way around these sections. I marked them off with a Sharpie. I just had to kind of eyeball it. You can put the pendant in, and then you can you can't really see through the backside of the sheet silver to see where the stone is. So I just line it up next to it, and I just mark where I'm guesstimating the stone hole needs to be, and then I cut it off and I file it to the correct shape that I need. I'm always cutting these a little bit smaller than what I think is necessary for the stone. So now I've put the piece in, and it looks like a pretty good placement. I don't even think I'll need to open that up too much more. I will definitely smooth out those edges with some files. Going to do a light check just to see if this allows light to pass through like I like, and yeah, looks pretty good. And so now I'm going to cut out the section for the opal and then start smoothing this all out. I cut the opal hole just a little too low, but that's okay. It just exposes a little bit of the frame and the wire connections, but it's not too bad. And so I'm opening up the top part of this to allow the top part of the opal to be exposed and to let light through that part as well. You don't have to do this with the opal, it doesn't need light from the back. I just decided to. That way there wasn't just like kind of this weird, backing to the opal. You could leave a backing there, it wouldn't look different. I just did this out of preference. Again, if you're not following the exact size of this piece, to the T, you can, you don't have to use this as a specific reference for whatever piece you're making. You know, cut out the size that you need for your stones and cut out the shape that you need for your stones. Again, this is just a reference so you all know the backplating process for your pieces. So now I can see the back of the opal and light will pass through there. Again, just kind of a personal preference. You don't have to do this for opals. I would suggest doing it for like an amethyst or something like that to allow the color to be illuminated of the stone. And so now I'm just kind of marking off the extra portions that I need to remove on this other side. I'm going to remove those, file it down, and then I'm also going to smooth out the edges on the outside of the piece. Using the files, I'm removing this outer edge, and I'm also kind of beveling the backside of the piece where it all fuses together. And what I mean by that is I'm just taking my file and running it over the edge to make the edge not just, you know, a 90-degree angle, but I'm making it kind of a flat back, then a little bit of a like 45-degree angle, and then it goes down to the, you know, 90-degree angle of the bezel. And so I'm just kind of, it's called beveling the edge, and so what I'm doing is just beveling the entire side and making that nice and smoothed over. Makes it smooth so that way when anyone holds it, it's a nice smooth feeling and it's not like a sharp edge or anything like that. I definitely recommend doing this to all of your back plates. And, you know, just a lot of your sheet in general, when you've made a big piece like this, you want to make sure all of the edges are not sharp. And so that's looking like it fits pretty darn good. The edges are where I want them to be. Obviously, this thing is pretty gnarly looking right now, so what we need to do is set this in the pickle pot. If you don't have a pickle pot, you can use like an old crock pot or something like that. Pickle is an acid solution that removes all of the scorch and the nastiness of soldering. So this is going to sit in the pickle pot, and then in the next part of this tutorial I'm going to show you the polishing and then the final oxidization of this piece. So thank you all so much. I hope you enjoyed this and have a great weekend.